As I am writing the script, I have just finished rating nearly all the games in the Trijam 131st Game Jam competition. Let me be the first to say that I have no experience in game jams at all, so, using my unbelievably high intellect, I decided it was apt for me to enter one that only gave me 3 hours despite having only made games in month time frames. Nevertheless, I persisted that I was going to do this, dodging other responsibilities that come with being 18, such as getting ready for college. But let's go ahead and hop straight into why I did this. I had just recently finished my senior year of high school, and got my results back from FBLA Nationals that my game did not move on to the semifinals. Expect a video on that too. Of course I was a tad disappointed, but I decided to try my hand in another competition where I could get feedback from others, and also give myself a shorter time limit. Recently, I have been watching a lot of game jam videos from channels like Devlog and Binbonk. Seriously, check these two out. Their videos are super entertaining and can give you a look on how hectic these jams can be. I decided to follow in their footsteps, but the only problem was that I wasn't sure which jam to join. I then remembered back to one of Vimlark's videos where he mentioned a special jam named the Trijam, which happened every week. So there we go, case closed, right? Not exactly. Like I've stated before, this was my first game jam, and it had a time limit of only 3 hours. You get 3 days to finish your game, but you're supposed to partition those hours however you want to create your game. I was really hesitant about joining at first due to the fact that I had no experience, but I decided that I would likely always use this excuse, and pushed myself to participate. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? Right? Anyways, I was antsy to start, but the competition started in about a week, so, for right then, I just sat back and watched some more videos on game jams. During this time, a poll was being run for this Trijam, with 5 different choices to be the theme of your game. For anyone unaware, typically jams have a central theme that you base your game around, and, while optional, it is highly recommended. I took a glance at my 5 choices and immediately knew which one I wanted. Voices lead the way. Immediately, an idea jumped into my head for this theme, involving a bat using echolocation to light up the level. The other 4 were interesting, to say the least. The 2 that seemed to be the least voted for were threats to humans and behavioral changes. It's understandable too, as there doesn't seem to be a lot of creative liberty that you can take with these themes. Marine life is also a theme, and I thought that I could probably change the bat to a dolphin to satisfy this. Lastly was my least favorite one, genetics. Now, genetics is a really fun theme and idea, and I took a lot of biology and had several ideas for genetic-themed games. The only problem is that all of my ideas were way too ambitious for the 3-hour time frame. I decided to cast my votes for Voices Lead the Way, and let fate hopefully steer the competition out of the way of genetics. Every day, I would get up to check the poll. Heck yeah. Voices Lead the Way is at the top of the leaderboard. I was sitting pretty comfortable just brainstorming on more ways to expand upon it. Flash forward a few more days and I decided to check the poll again despite Voices leading the poll by a large amount. God no, genetics is first and by a large majority. Tomorrow was the start of the competition, and I had to think of a plan for my game fast. My first go-to idea was a small platformer where you are dodging enemies by having your character mutate their DNA to change them into different animals with different abilities, starring a character that was eerily similar to Kirby. However, as I started to think about it, there were 3 problems. 1. I felt the idea was a little too derivative. I figured that there would be plenty of other games with the same premise that would have executed it way better than me, and there were. 2. My last 2 games had both been platformer-based, and I wanted to try to challenge myself with a new genre. And 3. I just felt like I would have spent so much time on the overall framework that I wouldn't have been able to polish the game to my liking. Instead, I decided to sit back for a bit and just think about what other ideas genetics involved. My brain works in weird ways. I get obsessed easily with certain hobbies, movies, shows, and games to the point where I consume it all in 1 week and then finally get burnt out from how much I've been seeing it. Thankfully, this worked to my advantage. I had recently picked up a nostalgic app from when I was 9 that I used to have a lot of fun playing despite its minimalistic design, Pocket Frogs. The game is simple. You start off with 2 frogs and you can breed them. They have different patterns and colors which can randomly be mixed to get a new frog. You can take them to a pond to find other frogs with new patterns and colors to diversify your gene pool. Of course, this kind of game usually only works on a phone where you play it in small intervals because there isn't much gameplay other than collecting. I did like the idea of breeding frogs to obtain a certain pattern, however, and, at that moment, I was reminded of an old puzzle game that I used to play on Cool Math as a child. Factory Balls. The idea of the game was that you were given a certain ball to replicate, and then you would dip the ball in certain paints and use certain objects to give it patterns. From there, my idea was pretty much solidified, a game where you breed several different frogs to achieve a very specific type of frog. I thought this idea was super simple on paper. I would make 5 levels of various difficulty where you would have up to 6 frogs to replicate the goal frog. I knew from watching a bunch of YouTube videos that scope creep ended up killing a lot of developers because they would attempt to add so much stuff that they would go over the 3-hour time limit. So I decided to stick with my base idea, and any time I had left would be spent polishing. Yeah. Anyways, it was still a while before the jam, and I wanted to think about the basics of how the game would work. I decided to sketch out 5 puzzles on a piece of paper and go from there. The first level would be easy to understand. You just drag the 2 frogs together and then immediately get the goal frog, showing you a cause and effect relationship between your actions. The second level introduced multiple frogs, and the third level would introduce a specific order. Levels 4 and 5 essentially just expanded the difficulty. I figured this game would be pretty simple. I would create the sprites for the patterns and frogs separately, and then instance the patterns in at the beginning of the scene depending on the variable that the frog has. Then, the game will make an array of patterns that list them in the order they were placed. Each pattern gets a respective z-index that correlates to their index number. A z-index in a 2D game disregards the x and y portions of a sprite. The higher a z-index is, the more in front it will appear to be, allowing you to layer several sprites without causing confusion to the program. I decided to also start setting up my space for development. I already had created a few music tracks, which, shameless plug time, you should check out on my YouTube channel. Yep, click those cards in the top right please. Thank you. And a couple of sound effects as well, all in Rhythmic Ultimate. I decided to also set up my actual program in Godot, so that I don't have to rush to get all the standard settings. Just the usual stuff like resolution and where it will be saved on my computer. Meanwhile, I was trying to formulate a name for the game. I later gave this task to my mom. Soon, the next day was upon me. I locked myself in my room and started development. I first focused on creating the frog sprites that you see on the screen now. I started with a base one, with a blinking animation. I also added a darker and lighter variant to give more difficulty to the puzzles. This is the part where I should mention that I also set up extra restrictions upon myself. Originally with the bat idea, I was going to use only the Game Boy palette with just 4 different shades of green. Due to the fact that this game relied heavily on color and ease of seeing pattern, I decided to go with the NES color palette, and design my sprites around their general resolution, 8x8 and 16x16, with the exception of one thing, the background, which we'll get to soon. I forgot to record most of the sprites, but I did manage to record myself creating the patterns for the frogs. I wanted to make a lot of variety in the patterns so that the player could easily differentiate them, while also making it obvious to those who are colorblind. I went back and forth between the sprites to make sure that they were centered on the frogs and would flow smoothly when placed on top of each other. As for the background, I really wanted to create a Dr. Mario feel because I used to love playing that game, and I wanted to have a medical/science setting. I made a magnifying glass after not being able to create a microscope. The background itself, as alluded to before, is a much higher resolution than an actual NES background, but I still thought it looked good, so I decided to bend my rules a bit. I made a scrolling grid background just to add an extra flair and made sure the timing was good enough. I then began to start exporting all the patterns I created into the program and created an array, which, when given a certain value, will return a specific pattern. That part was easy enough. Then, I create a system where I can change the frog's shades, and then start importing them into the level template scene. I decided that I had enough of pushing the Windows buttons to X out of the tab I was in for the game, so I quickly created a singleton, which is essentially a global scene that any piece of code can access, so that when the player hits the escape key, they're booted out of the game. This is when I started creating the actual level details themselves, and put a frog in the center of the magnifying glass as well as the goal pattern. So far, everything was going exactly according to plan, which wouldn't make a very good game dev video. Thankfully for my YouTube views, the peaceful workflow didn't stay for long. I had completely overlooked the fact that I didn't have a control scheme down. How are the players going to choose which frogs they wanted to breed? I decided that the most intuitive control scheme would be allowing the users to drag and drop frogs to pick and choose which patterns and colors they wanted. This would have been simple, but I have actually never worked with a drag and drop code before, so I had to look up a useful tutorial by Bramwell Williams, who I really recommend if you are using Godot and want to know the ins and outs. I used the code, but it didn't seem to work until I fiddled around with my syntax a little bit more, and then managed to get it functional. Afterwards, I started making it so the patterns also got dragged along with the frog. This is where crap really started to hit the fan. My next feature to add was to update the frog in the middle when you drag frogs together. One of the first issues I ran into is that it gets really confusing which frog controls what after your first breed. What I ended up deciding on was that when the player breeds a frog on their first move, a frog in the middle will randomly appear out of thin air. They can then take a singular frog and drag it to the middle to keep adding to what I refer to as the born frog, stacking the new design on top of it. My second issue was with the code itself. I created an iterating function with a for loop that went through and added patterns each time you bred a frog. For some reason, which is later realized way down the line, my code would not add the Z indexes properly, and seemingly just stuck the patterns in random positions. After around an hour and a half of work, I decided to call today quits, spending approximately 2.5 hours total on the first day. I woke up the next day with a confidence level that was inversely proportional to my original ego. Knowing that I only had about half an hour of time left for the jam, I knew I'd have to break out the extra time. While this is totally allowed during the jam, it kinda defeats the purpose and also gets you a lower score, but I was determined to finish. I started off the morning by reading through my code once more and fixing the annoying bug that defeated the entire purpose of the game. After about an hour's worth of work, I'd managed to find it and figure out it was the fact that when I sent for the index, I subtracted 1 from the iteration variable. Essentially, I was lagging behind on which pattern goes where. With some goofy looking code that inverts the order of the patterns twice, for some bizarre reason, I finally got it working. I'll spare you more of those details by moving on to the other boring stuff such as creating the menu and win screens. I drew up some really simple stuff in Sprite like confetti in a background, and then made it flow into the level with a simple fade in. The only thing I had left to create was the win states. This sounds much easier than it actually was. The fix I made for the patterns on the frogborn meant that the arrays it used was not in order. My best bet was to pull a yandere dev and use a bunch of ands, ors, and ifs. It contained incredibly specific directions that could only be done by doing the puzzle in a certain way, which caused problems later. I decided to compile the code and make the executable file. After I was done, I uploaded to itch.io and designed the page a bit and turned off the computer to go on my daily walk and reflect on how poor my coding skills were. For the name, I was completely stuck. The best one I had come up with was Fruckin' Frogs, which I thought was a little too dicey for a game about cute little frogs. Thankfully, my mom pulled through by putting up a post, eventually landing on the name Totally Matching, which I thought was very fitting and cute. After getting back from my walk, I went back in and created an HTML version that would allow others to play in their browser. After everything was said and done, my final time ended up being 4 hours, 58 minutes, and 36 seconds. I was disappointed that I could not reach the time limitation, but I am still pretty proud of my work. Let's go over some things I did wrong though. 1. I did so many things that I have never had experience coding, such as drag and drop and z-indexing through code. 2. Those super specific win states I had, it ended up screwing people over who got the right frog but through a different solution that I didn't expect. 3. Finally, the lack of a proper reset button was frustrating for a lot of people. I did have a reset feature built into the frogs, but it was hard to explain and not intuitive. As for the page itself, I decided to put a description talking about the controls and how it was my first game jam. I also made some cover art in Metabang that you can see on the screen right now. So how does the game play? Well, let's have a look. I'm going to stop here so you can try your hand at it, or what little there is left. If you guys want to check out the game, click the link in the description. It doesn't work on mobile, but it does work through the browser. There are a lot of cool games made by others for this jam as well, that you should check out too. They all did great within the constraints of time. Overall, I really enjoyed the experience and I will definitely participate in game jams more once I am in college. I really recommend it to any game devs out there. Even if you cannot make the time limit, it teaches you a lot about the workflow. Hey guys, I'm here with an addendum, and I'm just going to be going over the results of the competition. So for my first game jam, I think I actually did pretty well. My game ended up ranking 7th out of 24. And we'll just go down with what happened. So how well does this game fit the theme? It got ranked number 3, which I thought was, yeah, it's pretty accurate because my game is all about genetics. As for the visuals, I also got number 3, which I'm really surprised about. There were some really good games out there with visuals. Overall, I got 7. How much did you enjoy the game overall? Number 8. The gameplay was kind of boring, I'm not gonna lie. The audio was number 9, and so was the gameplay. And did I make it in 3 hours? Put 5 by default. After watching my video, it should be obvious that I did not make it in 3 hours. So, but yes, I am very surprised with how I did. And I'm glad that I competed in this competition. I'd love to do it again. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe because I'll be doing 2 more game dev videos, one about my FBLA project and the other one about a game I am currently making. Thank you guys for watching and have a radical day.